You wake up to the sound of the gas lamps flicking to life, not for warmth, but for judgment. The air is heavy, not just with coal smoke, but with something worse, expectation. It clings to the curtains, presses against the walls, and settles in every heartbeat. Outside your door, carriage wheels clatter over cobblestones, footsteps measured, eyes trained on propriety. Someone whispers, "Mind your manners." You pull your shawl tighter, hoping your posture will hide your rebellion, hoping it will hide your thoughts. But the tremor in your hands betrays you. It's 1885. The height of the Victorian age, where life is governed by rules too numerous to count, and every gesture carries weight. They say it is refinement, decency, civility, a system to make the world orderly. Women bow, men straighten their collars, children learn to smile without teeth. They polish their words as carefully as their boots, measuring every breath against society's gaze. But beneath the lace, behind the polite glances, lies something darker. Fear wrapped in etiquette, desire smothered in cloth, rebellion hidden in whispers. The city is alive with rules that control bodies, thoughts, even hearts. A single slip, a glance too long, a laugh too loud, a step taken without permission could ruin a name forever. This isn't just history. This is what it felt like to live inside the machinery of a society obsessed with appearances, where every movement is watched, every choice weighed, and every soul quietly policed. Welcome to the strange rules of Victorian times. And tonight, you're not just reading about it, you're living it. You wake to the sound of the maid's soft knock, 2 taps, then silence. Never 3. 3 would be presumptuous, as if she were calling to an equal. The air is cool, scented faintly with coal smoke and lavender starch from the linens that have been pressed overnight. Morning in a Victorian home begins not with sunlight, but with sequence, a choreography learned by every inhabitant from the master to the smallest scullery girl. Nothing is spontaneous here. Even the act of waking has its rules. The house itself feels alive, though no one would ever say such a thing aloud. The floorboards creak only when the servants pass. The grandfather clock in the hallway seems to breathe, exhaling propriety with every pendulum swing. Curtains are drawn halfway to let in just enough light for respectability. Too much suggests vanity, too little invites suspicion. Each object in the room has its own posture. Chairs waiting at right angles, a teacup resting precisely on its saucer, lace folded so crisply it could cut the air. You could almost believe the furniture is judging you. Downstairs, the morning ritual unfolds like a quiet mass. The cook does not speak until spoken to. The butler stands just outside the dining room, ready to open the door before a hand reaches for the knob. Every gesture is a form of language. One wrong motion and the entire hierarchy trembles. A servant caught humming might find herself dismissed. A daughter who greets her father before her mother may spend the day in disgrace. Even laughter carries rank. A lady's giggle is a whisper. A man's amusement must never echo. At the breakfast table, you lift the spoon with your right hand, keeping the elbow close to the ribs. The silver trembles as you sip, careful not to touch the rim with your lips. A single cough could betray nerves. Across from you, the patriarch lowers his newspaper by an inch, not enough to show interest, only authority. The silence stretches, as though the walls themselves are listening. Etiquette here is not merely behavior, it is breath, blood, and inheritance. The house enforces it the way churches enforce prayer. Every sound outside feels vulgar by comparison: the cry of a newsboy, the clatter of carriage wheels, the faraway bell of a milkman. Civilization, the Victorians believed, was the art of hiding one's natural self beneath 1,000 tiny obediences. The home, then, was not a shelter but a stage. The drawing room became a place of performance, the dining table a pulpit, and the hall mirror a confessional. Each person was an actor rehearsing grace, each gesture a prayer against chaos. But sometimes, in the quiet between footsteps, You sense rebellion, the cook muttering under her breath, a daughter secretly reading a novel behind closed doors, a butler pausing too long at the window, watching the fog roll over the garden walls. The house may whisper etiquette, but the people inside it still dream. They dream of laughter without consequence, of warmth without permission, of a morning where the first sound is not the polite knock of a servant, but the open joy of being free. And so, under the hush of ticking clocks and polished manners, something restless begins to stir the faintest sound of change, breathing beneath the lace. The art of greeting, in Victorian England, could determine the fate of entire reputations. A bow held too long suggested desperation, too short, defiance. When a man approached a lady on a cobblestone street, he was expected to remove his hat in one smooth motion, lower his eyes, and incline his head just enough to convey respect without warmth. A lady, in return, would tilt her chin ever so slightly, allowing her gaze to meet his for no more than the length of a single breath. That breath, that fleeting exchange, was the line between propriety and scandal. You watch them from a distance, these daily rituals of restraint, two figures passing under a soot-colored sky, their gestures so precise it seems rehearsed. There is poetry in their stiffness, elegance in their denial. The bow is not a greeting. It is a promise that nothing indecent will follow. The blink, the smallest flicker of acknowledgement, becomes the entire language of emotion, a sentence reduced to a syllable. In this world, even desire must learn to curtsy. Inside parlors and ballrooms, the ritual deepens. The bow becomes performance art, each movement calibrated to class. Aristocrats bend only from the waist, confident in their superiority. Clerks and tradesmen bow deeper, eager to prove refinement. Servants bow silently, almost invisibly, their humility rehearsed until it becomes instinct. Every tilt of the spine reinforces a social order so rigid that even gravity must obey. And when the ladies respond with that delicate nod, that careful lowering of lashes, they are not returning courtesy, but protecting themselves from interpretation. For women, a gaze could wound as easily as a blade. To linger on a man's face was to risk ruin. To avoid it entirely was to seem cold. Society demanded that every glance be both inviting and unattainable, a paradox that kept them forever balanced on the edge of propriety. Mothers trained their daughters to look without looking, to smile without teeth, to admire a man's politeness while pretending not to notice his presence. The world had taught them early that silence was safer than sincerity. Even the mirrors seemed to play along. They reflected posture, not truth bodies bound in whalebone, expressions schooled into civility. The true self, the one that wished to speak or laugh or reach out without permission, was folded away beneath layers of fabric and fear. In the glint of silver cutlery or the shadowed glass of a shop window, you might glimpse it for a moment. A woman's eyes catching light before she looks down, a man's fingers twitching before they find stillness again. Then it is gone, swallowed by etiquette. And yet, beneath all this ceremony, humanity persists. The bow may be measured, the blink controlled, but hearts still quicken in defiance of formality. In that single second where eyes meet and retreat, a forbidden world blooms and vanishes unseen, unspoken, yet deeply felt. The Victorians never knew how much rebellion could live inside something as small as a glance. Morning comes softly, and with it, the ritual of dressing. The air smells faintly of starch, perfume, and the iron tang of stay-busk metal, warmed by touch. A young woman stands before her mirror, arms raised as the maid draws the laces taut across her back. Each pull is deliberate, practiced a quiet violence disguised as grace. The corset tightens like a secret being fastened shut. Breath becomes shallow, ribs press inward, and the spine straightens in surrender. To breathe too deeply would wrinkle the silk. To faint, however, would be forgiven. In this world, beauty is measured not in comfort, but in endurance. A narrow waist is virtue made visible, proof of discipline, restraint, and silent suffering. Doctors warn of fainting spells and displaced organs, yet society praises the silhouette more than the soul inside it. Mothers pass down the art of stillness to their daughters as if it were prayer. A lady must occupy less space than desire allows. One manual insists, and speaks softer than the rustle of her skirts. The corset ensures both. You can almost hear the city breathing differently, women everywhere, inhaling in fragments, holding decorum where lungs once expanded freely. At tea tables, no one speaks of the bruises left behind, the indentations on skin that linger long after the garment is removed. The pain becomes part of the costume, folded into the etiquette of the body. To complain is unfeminine, to suffer elegantly is divine. But in private, rebellion takes smaller forms. A loosened lace before bed, a deep, forbidden gasp when alone by the window. Some women tie their corsets looser than fashion allows, daring gravity to defy expectation. Others, in moments of solitude, remove them entirely and watch their reflection breathe for the first time, a rib cage rising like a tide returning to shore. They feel their bodies as their own for a few stolen minutes before the laces return, each knot a promise to the world that they will behave again. Even the language of breath becomes coded. She swooned, the papers say, when a woman collapses at a dance, as though frailty itself were an ornament. Men rush to her aid, mistaking suffocation for sweetness. Society applauds the fainting fit. It makes women delicate, makes men heroic, and keeps everyone in their proper place. The room fills with handkerchiefs and whispers, and no one dares call it what it is, the sound of a body begging for air. As evening falls, the same woman stands once more before her mirror. The light of the lamp paints her reflection in amber and shadow. She draws a long, secret breath, slow, quiet, defiant. For a moment, her chest expands against the silk, testing its limits. Then she exhales, smooths her gown, and smiles as she's been taught. Outside, the city hums with quiet repression, and every corseted breath keeps the illusion alive. The clock in the drawing room strikes 4, and suddenly the house awakens not with noise, but with movement choreographed to the minute. Curtains are drawn to soften the light, porcelain cups gleam in careful rows, and the kettle hums on the fire like a domestic hymn. Afternoon tea is not simply refreshment, it is a ceremony of order, a social altar built from china and sugar. To pour too soon would signal impatience, to pour too late would hint at neglect. Even time itself, in Victorian life, must bow to ritual. In this hour, the house becomes a theatre of restraint. The lady of the house moves between guests like a conductor of silence. A raised eyebrow replaces speech, a nod replaces warmth. Her smile is precise, trained to express grace without affection. Conversation drifts in soft, careful tones, as though the words might crack the porcelain. Topics are chosen as delicately as pastries: the weather, the Queen's latest engagement, a neighbour's illness, never politics, never passion, and never grief. A single misstep in subject could turn the room to glass. Servants glide in shadows, refilling cups before they are empty, yet never looking directly at those they serve. The silver spoon must rest at exactly 4 o'clock in the saucer, its handle aligned with invisible geometry. Milk before tea is scandal in certain circles, tea before milk a crime in others. Every home follows its own code, and guests are expected to divine it without instruction. A wrong order of pouring could ruin a reputation faster than gossip. Outside, coal dust settles on the window panes, and the sound of the street is muffled by velvet drapes. Inside, time slows. Each tick of the clock punctuates civility. This is the empire at rest, its anxieties wrapped in etiquette, its ambitions steeped in Darjeeling. Tea is not merely a drink, but a mirror of control. The sweetness must be measured, the bitterness hidden. The empire drinks serenity to forget the noise it creates elsewhere. Yet beneath the lace and steam, rebellion brews. Some women host teas not for gossip but for gathering quiet councils of suffragists and thinkers, hiding defiance behind lemon slices and laughter. They talk of education, of freedom, of the absurdity of measuring worth by posture and porcelain. Each sip is a small act of protest, swallowed quickly before a husband enters the room. The revolution, it seems, begins with raised cups and lowered voices. As the final crumbs are brushed away, the lady glances once more at the clock. The ceremony has lasted 45 minutes, long enough to suggest leisure, short enough to preserve mystery. The guests rise, murmur their thanks, and depart into the soft grey of the London afternoon. Behind them, the cups are gathered, the silence returns, and the house exhales. Tomorrow at 4, it will all begin again, as predictable as the ticking of the clock that rules them all. In a Victorian home, every door spoke of class. Some were meant to be opened with confidence, others not at all. The heavy oak door of the master's study, for instance, was never touched by a servant's hand. It waited in the hallway like a sleeping beast, polished, silent, sacred. To knock without summons was to invite ruin. Even the children learned early. Some spaces were not meant to exist for them. The house, though large, was divided by invisible borders, each one guarded by manners sharper than locks. You can hear the difference in how people approach it. The lady of the house glides through her domain, fingertips barely grazing brass handles that gleam like little suns. Her husband, returning from business, moves with authority, no hesitation, no glance behind. But the servants, they hover just short of the threshold. A butler clears his throat before entering. A maid might wait hours for permission. The sound of a door opening can mean anything in this household: permission, intrusion, or punishment. The architecture itself enforces the hierarchy. There are servant passages, narrow and dark, designed to conceal the labor that keeps the family's grace alive. Doors that lead to these hallways are painted the color of shadow, deliberately uninviting. In contrast, the family's rooms gleam in cream and gold, their handles engraved like jewelry. Even the hinges know their place. The grand doors open silently, while the servants' doors creak, a warning system dressed as coincidence. Children grow up, surrounded by this quiet geography of obedience. They learn that not every space belongs to them, even in their own home. The nursery door remains ajar, a symbol of innocence. The drawing room's door is always half closed, guarding adult conversation, the study always locked. A door is not just wood, it is morality carved into architecture. Behind one might lie discipline, behind another, secrets wrapped in lace. There are stories whispered among the servants of maids dismissed for entering the wrong room, of footmen accused of theft after opening a drawer they were not meant to touch. Some swear the house remembers these trespasses. Doors that once opened easily now resist. Knobs turn cold beneath the guilty hand. Superstition grows where etiquette breeds fear. The house, they say, defends itself. One winter night, when the lamps burn low, a maid pauses before the forbidden study. She hears nothing, no voice, no movement, only the clock ticking in the hall. The brass handle glows faintly in the firelight. For a moment, she imagines what lies beyond. Perhaps warmth, perhaps freedom, perhaps nothing at all. Her hand trembles, hovering an inch away. Then the floorboard creaks behind her, and she withdraws, vanishing into the servants' corridor as if the thought itself were a sin. The next morning, everything continues as before. The master's door remains untouched, its surface flawless, its secret unbroken. The household resumes its rhythm of quiet restraint, pretending not to hear what the walls remember, that somewhere between obedience and curiosity, a life can vanish without ever leaving the room. In Victorian society, gloves were not accessories, they were armor. No hand was naked without consequence. A lady's glove spoke before she ever did, a soft announcement of class, virtue, and intent. White gloves for purity, black for mourning, grey for travel, lavender for half-grief. Each shade was a sentence, and each crease a whisper. Even the texture mattered. Silk for grace, kid leather for propriety, lace for the daring sort who pretended not to be. A woman without gloves was as scandalous as one without modesty. In the streets of London, you could read a person's story just by watching their hands. The working class bore the raw truth of labor, rough palms, cracked knuckles, sun-stained skin. The upper class hid theirs beneath layers of cotton and decorum. Hands, after all, were dangerous. They touched, they gestured, they revealed. Gloves ensured that human warmth never crossed where class boundaries should remain. The handshake became a muffled symbol, civility without contact. Every home had a glove box, usually lined with faded velvet. Inside lay pairs folded like letters never meant to be read again. Gloves for church, for calling, for carriages, for funerals. They smelled faintly of lavender and starch, sometimes of secrets, the faint powder of perfume left behind by a trembling hand. In polite circles, removing one's glove was an event of intimacy. At a ball, to unglove one hand before a dance was invitation enough to set a room whispering. To drop one accidentally was theatre. To retrieve it, a man's opportunity for gallantry or disgrace, depending on who was watching. Etiquette books dictated even the smallest gesture. Gloves must always be worn outdoors, regardless of weather. Indoors, they could be removed only after proper introduction. One must never eat, write, or play cards while gloved. Yet to reveal a bare hand too soon implied a hunger unbecoming of one's station. The absurdity of it all was the point rules existed not to be understood, but to keep people from ever feeling entirely free. Beneath the lace and formality, however, emotion persisted. Lovers found ways to speak through seams and fabric. A gloved fingertip brushing another in passing could carry more meaning than a sonnet. In drawing rooms and carriages, entire romances unfolded in the space between buttons. Some women embroidered secret initials inside their gloves, pressed against their pulse where no one could see. Others hid folded notes within the lining, fragments of words that risked everything just to be held. At dusk, when the streets glowed with lamplight and the fog curled low, discarded gloves could sometimes be found lying in the gutters. Lost, forgotten, or deliberately abandoned, no one could tell. A pair of empty gloves looked strangely human, their fingers limp, their forms suggesting hands that had finally escaped. In a world obsessed with propriety, that small image felt almost rebellious. The next, the city would sweep them away, and the ritual would begin again, the soft imprisonment of touch, disguised as elegance. The city at dawn is nearly silent, as if holding its breath before the day begins. Carriages have not yet rolled from their stables, and the coal carts still wait by the river. What you hear instead is the faint hum of civility being prepared. Boots brushed clean, curtains tied back, the careful click of latches as London's respectable classes step into the day. Every movement outside the home carries expectation. The street itself is an extension of the parlour, and one must walk through it with the same restraint. Victorians treated noise as a form of rebellion. To shout, whistle, or laugh aloud was to risk the label of indecent. Streets were for display, not expression. A gentleman's footsteps were to fall evenly, his stride measured, his hands tucked neatly behind his back. A lady's pace was smaller still, her skirts whispering along the cobblestones, her eyes trained downward to avoid appearing bold. Every gesture was part of a delicate choreography meant to hide the chaos of being alive. Even children learned silence early. Theirs was a city where games were confined to gardens, and laughter was muffled behind gloves. In poorer districts, sound was unavoidable, the hammering of smiths, the wails of infants, the cries of vendors. Yet these noises were treated by the upper class as evidence of moral failure. Quiet, to them, was purity. Noise was sin. The wealthier the neighborhood, the softer the street became, until conversation itself felt like an intrusion. There were exceptions, of course. The ringing of church bells was holy, the clip of horse hooves, noble, the call of a newspaper boy, regrettably necessary. But the human voice, raw, unfiltered, had no place in polite society. Etiquette manuals advised against speaking to strangers outdoors, against laughing in public, against singing unless invited. Women who spoke too loudly risked being labeled unrefined. Men who did so appeared common. Silence, paradoxically, became the say-to-the-five, loudest proof of breeding. Still, the city could not hold its breath forever. In the cracks of its composure, other sounds thrived: the rustle of pamphlets handed out by suffragists at twilight, the distant songs of factory workers returning home, the soft hum of street musicians who played for the ones too tired to pretend. Their melodies wove through the alleyways, thin but persistent, like the voice of the city itself trying to remember its pulse. On certain foggy evenings, when gaslight blurred the edges of the world, a passerby might pause to listen. A violin drifting through the mist, the echo of boots where none should be, the faint laughter of a girl who forgot the rules. These sounds, forbidden and fleeting, felt like glimpses of something truer, a world not yet bound by etiquette. By morning, order would return, the carriages would roll, the doors would open, and the quiet would resume its rule. But somewhere, beneath the hush of civility, London would keep that echo, a memory of when the street dared, just for a moment, to speak. In the Victorian parlour, every object had its place, every table measured, every portrait hung at the proper height, every chair angled to suggest harmony without comfort. But sometimes, amid all the symmetry, there was one seat left deliberately untouched. It sat slightly apart from the rest, dusted daily but never warmed by use. The empty chair. It was not merely furniture, it was memory made visible, a space reserved for those who could not return or those society had quietly erased. At first glance, the custom seemed tender. Families left a chair for the deceased during supper, for soldiers lost abroad, or for loved ones taken too soon by fever. To sit in it was unthinkable. The emptiness carried a holiness all its own, like a breath held between prayers. Mothers would glance at it when the room grew too loud. Fathers pretended not to see it at all. The space reminded them that grief was not to be spoken, only observed politely and in silence. But in other homes, the empty chair carried a different weight. Sometimes it marked disgrace, a daughter who eloped, a son dismissed from university in shame, a brother transported to the colonies for theft. Their absence was turned into ritual. Guests understood without asking. The chair stood as warning as much as memorial, proof that even love could be banished by impropriety. It was not death that frightened Victorians most, but dishonor. Etiquette books never mentioned this custom, yet every household seemed to know its language. The chair was placed near the hearth in winter, near the window in summer, always visible, always apart. Fresh flowers might appear beside it on certain anniversaries, though no one would admit who placed them there. Some claimed that, late at night, when all the candles had burned low, the wood creaked softly, as if remembering the weight it once held. Servants told stories of shadows lingering near it, of a cushion slightly depressed by something unseen. But the family would not speak of such things. Respectability could not coexist with ghosts. Children, though, were not bound by such restraint. They would dare each other to sit in the forbidden seat, giggling until a sudden chill silenced them. The bravest might last a few seconds before leaping up again, eyes wide, as if the air itself had scolded them. The next morning, the cushion would be fluffed and the room restored. No evidence left of childish rebellion. Only the faint scent of candle smoke lingered, like a reprimand. By day, the parlour returned to order. Conversation resumed, teacups clinked, and the empty chair waited quietly at the edge of vision. Its silence did what words could not. It reminded everyone that beneath the velvet and virtue, there were fractures too delicate to name. And when the last guest left, and the final candle guttered out, the room would dim around that one small shape, the outline of absence, preserved with impeccable manners. In the Victorian home, mirrors were not merely objects, they were witnesses. Their glass held more than reflection. It held memory, superstition, and shame. A mirror saw everything that could not be spoken aloud. It watched women faint in corsets, and men measure their morality by the shine of their boots. It stared back without judgment, yet its silence unnerved. People began to fear that mirrors remembered too much, and so, when death came, they covered them. The custom was simple and absolute. When a loved one died, every mirror in the house was veiled in black cloth. The reasoning varied, depending on who you asked. Some said it was respect that grief should not be reflected. Others whispered of superstition, that the soul, upon leaving the body, might lose its way and become trapped behind the glass. Curtains were drawn, clocks stopped, mirrors hidden. The house became a dark chamber of suspended time, where the living pretended not to exist until mourning was complete. Even outside of death, mirrors demanded caution. Etiquette manuals warned against vanity of the glass, urging women to check their appearance sparingly and men to avoid grooming in public. A mirror was acceptable only as a tool, never as a temptation. Too much self-regard, Victorians believed, led to moral decay, and yet every home displayed them gilded, oval, ornate, as if to confess their own hypocrisy. They wanted beauty, but only when it pretended to be virtue. At twilight, when the last of the sun dimmed through lace curtains, the mirrors came alive. Candlelight turned the surface liquid, bending reality into soft distortions. The reflection of a parlor might shimmer like a dream, its edges trembling. A person standing before it could swear they saw someone else there, not a ghost exactly, but a version of themselves they could not explain. Children avoided looking too long. Maids crossed themselves when polishing the glass. Some swore they saw movement, even when the room was still. But the mirror's power was not just spectral, it was social. It enforced perfection. Before a dinner party, a lady would study her reflection, ensuring her hair fell obediently. Her dress betrayed no human curve. Her expression suggested serenity without warmth. A gentleman would check his posture, his cufflinks, his restraint. Each glance became rehearsal for performance. What the mirror reflected was not truth but expectation, a world polished until it gleamed, hollow beneath the shine. And so the mirrors stayed, watching as generations passed, each one pretending to be more respectable than the last. When visitors came, they saw themselves reflected in the flawless glass and mistook it for grace. But sometimes, in the quiet between candle flickers, the mirror revealed something truer. A flicker of exhaustion behind the eyes, a mouth slightly trembling beneath its polite smile. It was then that one understood why Victorians feared their own reflection. The mirror did not lie, it only showed the cost of pretending. In the age of manners, touch was treacherous. The Victorians built an empire on formality, and nowhere was that formality more delicate than in the meeting of two hands. The handshake, that simplest human gesture, became a ritual so precise that sincerity vanished inside it. What had once been a sign of trust, proof that one carried no weapon, evolved into theater. Each handshake was weighed, watched, and silently judged. A gentleman's grip must be firm, but never forceful, confident, but never eager. A lady, if she extended her hand at all, must do so lightly, as though offering something breakable. To linger was to flirt. To release too soon was to insult. Manuals of etiquette prescribed the handshake as a moral test. In the clasp of the hand, one book warned, is revealed the nature of the soul. The irony, of course, was that no one dared reveal anything at all. In crowded parlors and garden parties, the ritual repeated endlessly. The air hummed with polite lies. Men smiled with teeth they didn't feel, trading compliments like coins. Women nodded in perfect rhythm, gloved fingers brushing against one another, contact without connection. Each introduction was a performance, and the handshake its curtain call. What mattered wasn't the touch itself, but the illusion it maintained. That civility meant goodness, that manners meant morality, that all was well beneath the chandeliers. There was a hierarchy even in the gesture. Nobility shook hands only with equals. Tradesmen bowed instead. Servants were expected to remain hands at their sides, invisible, unless commanded otherwise. A butler who accidentally brushed a guest's sleeve could be dismissed by mourning. In a world obsessed with order, even touch was a privilege rationed by rank. The handshake, rather than uniting, quietly divided. And yet, behind the etiquette lay longing. People craved authenticity in a society that forbade it. Lovers found excuses for handshakes that lingered too long. A widow might feel the faint tremor of sympathy in a clergyman's grasp and cherish it for months. Two reformers, meeting in secret to discuss abolition or suffrage, might seal their cause with a handshake that actually meant something. For a moment, truth lived there small, trembling, human before vanishing again into the machinery of manners. At dinner parties, when the final guest departed, hosts would comment on the impressions each handshake left behind. Cold as marble, someone might whisper, too eager, just right. Judgment replaced intimacy. Even friendship was quantified, measured through skin and gesture. The Victorians, it seemed, could trust everything except touch. Still, every now and then, in the quiet after company had gone, someone would lift their hand and study it, the palm still tingling faintly, the memory of warmth refusing to fade. For all their rules and restraint, they could not unlearn what the body already knew. That truth, however forbidden, is most clearly felt through contact. And so the handshake survived not as a greeting, but as a small rebellion disguised as courtesy. The grandest Victorian homes were built on silence, not the peace of tranquility, but the heavy quiet of unseen labor. Beneath the chandeliers and velvet drapes, an entire world moved in secret. Servants glided through corridors no guest would ever see, their presence marked only by the faint rustle of uniforms and the distant clink of china. To be a good servant, they said, was to be invisible. To be heard was to fail. At dawn, the house stirred without waking. Footmen lit the fires before the family rose, crouched low so the light would not spill into sleeping eyes. Maids dusted mantles and fluffed cushions, their footsteps soft as moth wings. The cook's kettle hissed before the clock struck 6, and the butler polished silver until his reflection looked more obedient than his face. By the time the mistress descended the stairs, the illusion of effortlessness had been restored. The world she saw was perfection. The world that made it was exhaustion. There were rules for everything. Servants were forbidden to speak unless spoken to. They could not look a guest in the eye, nor address their employer directly during meals. A good maid learned the rhythm of her mistress's day so precisely that she seemed to predict needs before they were voiced. A shawl draped before a chill was mentioned, a letter placed on the desk the moment the ink dried. Intuition became survival. Even mistakes had to be graceful. If a plate broke, the apology must sound quieter than the shatter. The architecture conspired in this silence. Narrow servants' corridors wound behind the walls like veins through a body. Hidden staircases allowed movement without intrusion. Bells and pulleys signaled commands from one floor to another, small tin chimes that dictated entire lives. A servant's world was measured in sound, the ding that summoned, the creak that betrayed, the clock that ruled every breath. Between those notes, they existed only as shadows of usefulness. Yet, within this invisibility, small rebellions bloomed. A scullery maid might hum softly while scrubbing, a forbidden melody swallowed by steam. A footman might pause at a window to glimpse the garden, daring to imagine what it would feel like to walk there without purpose. Sometimes, when the family was away, the servants would linger in the grand rooms, touch the piano keys, sit for a stolen minute on the silk chairs, taste the forbidden air of freedom. Then the key would turn in the door, and they'd vanish back into silence, as if they had never been. In the evenings, when candles burned low and the corridors smelled of wax and fatigue, the house fell quiet again. The family retired, satisfied, unaware of the quiet eyes still watching over their dreams. In that stillness, the servants rested their hands on the banisters, they'd polished 100 times, and listened to the hush they had created. It was not peace, it was duty, discipline, and dignity carved into footsteps no one ever heard. Rain was the great equalizer of Victorian life, but even the weather had to obey decorum. The moment the sky began to grey, London transformed into a choreography of umbrellas, black, orderly, and uniform, as mourning attire. To step outside without one was reckless. To open one at the wrong time was social suicide. The umbrella was not a tool of convenience, but a symbol of self-control. It declared to the world, "I am untouched by chaos." Etiquette manuals devoted entire paragraphs to the art of carrying one. A gentleman must never swing his umbrella or use it as a walking stick. Such gestures betrayed carelessness. A lady's umbrella should match her gloves and parasol, delicate, with a carved handle, preferably ivory or ebony, and always closed when not in use. To open an umbrella indoors was to tempt misfortune. It invites the devil's laughter, one superstition warned, and invites death into the room. No one quite knew why, but no one dared risk it. You can imagine the scene: a crowded London street under sudden rain, the air filled with the sound of thousands of drops striking canvas. The umbrellas move like clockwork, black circles blooming and closing in precise rhythm. Gentlemen tilt theirs politely away from ladies' faces. Coachmen angle them as shields when opening carriage doors. There is grace even in the storm, a practiced civility, as if the city itself refuses to admit discomfort. Beneath each canopy, propriety stays dry. But for the working poor, umbrellas were luxuries. Factory women and errand boys trudged bareheaded through the downpour, their clothes soaked, their steps splashing through the same puddles that polished boots avoided. They were the living reminder that etiquette was not morality, only privilege disguised as virtue. The well-mannered world preferred not to see them, their wet shoulders, their cold fingers. The rain erased social distance for a moment, but no one dared acknowledge it. In parlours, cafes, umbrellas rested neatly by the door, dripping in quiet disapproval. Hosts provided silver trays for them to drain, each handle turned outward for easy claiming. To take the wrong one, even by mistake, could spark gossip that lasted weeks. A misplaced umbrella hinted at absent-mindedness, or worse, at moral carelessness. Even weather could not excuse disorder. And yet, every so often, a gust of wind would make mockery of all this precision. A sudden squall down Fleet Street, a swirl of soot and rain, and the umbrellas would turn inside out, elegant ribs broken, silk flapping helplessly. In that instant, the city forgot its manners. Gentlemen cursed, ladies laughed, and servants ran to help their employers reclaim dignity from the storm. For a heartbeat, humanity returned unguarded, imperfect, alive. Then the rain eased, and the rules folded themselves back into place. The umbrellas closed like secrets, their wet fabric whispering as they were carried home, ready to wait for the next polite disaster. To smile too widely was to invite suspicion. In the Victorian age, joy was something best hidden, preferably behind lace, gloved hands, or a carefully trained expression. The smile, that spontaneous flare of humanity, was viewed with mistrust, a sign of weakness, madness, or moral looseness. To show one's teeth was to expose something raw and ungoverned, and the Victorians feared the ungoverned most of all. In portraits of the time, you'll notice it mouths closed, lips pressed gently together, eyes still as glass. The sitters do not smile. They compose themselves, immortalized in restraint. Even children, who might have laughed moments before, are instructed to stand solemnly. Photographers blamed the long exposure times, but that was only half the truth. The other half was decorum. To smile in a photograph would make one appear unserious, perhaps even common. The respectable face was calm, detached, unreadable, a face that gave nothing away. Society treated emotion like a stain. Manuals on deportment warned against unguarded laughter, calling it vulgar and animalistic. Women were especially cautioned. A wide grin could suggest flirtation, a loud laugh, hysteria. Men, meanwhile, were told to smile only in moderation, lest they appear unmanly. Even the shape of one's mouth became a moral statement. Lips too red were painted over with powder. Teeth too imperfect were hidden entirely. It was not beauty that mattered, but control. At gatherings, smiles existed only in fragments, a polite curve, a shadow of amusement, a gesture without sound. True laughter had to be softened into something almost invisible. A lady might press her handkerchief to her lips when amused. A gentleman might cough quietly instead of laughing. Joy became performance. It was permitted only when dressed properly, trimmed of excess, and stripped of sincerity. But in the spaces society forgot to watch, kitchens, alleys, the servants' quarters, laughter returned in its natural form, loud, unmeasured, human. The cook laughed over burnt pudding, the stable boy at his own clumsiness, the maid at the absurdities of her employers. Their laughter carried warmth that the drawing rooms lacked. It was laughter that filled lungs rather than corsets, that echoed rather than whispered. For those moments, the world felt alive again, a rebellion against the suffocation of manners. Still, there were cracks in the higher circles too. A daughter, caught in an unrestrained laugh at a dull dinner, might see her mother's sharp glance across the table, a warning masked as concern. She would lower her gaze, her lips trembling between defiance and apology. Later, alone before her mirror, she might test the forbidden gesture again, a wide smile. Unguarded, fleeting. For the first time all day, her reflection feels human. Then she smooths her face, exhales, and prepares to re-enter the world that fears happiness more than sin. And so the Victorians perfected the art of smiling without joy, a delicate deception, practiced until even the heart forgot it was pretending. A single square of linen could change everything. To the untrained eye, a handkerchief was an innocent accessory, a scrap of embroidered fabric tucked neatly into a pocket or glove. But in Victorian society, it was a language. Every flutter, every fold, every accidental drop carried meaning. In a world where words were rationed and emotion forbidden, people learned to speak with fabric instead. A lady's handkerchief, perfumed and stitched with initials, was as personal as a diary. It traveled with her everywhere, to church, to parties, even to funerals, a token of her station and refinement. But beyond its etiquette, it served as a weapon of subtle rebellion. To drop it before a gentleman was no accident. It was an invitation. To pick it up too quickly meant the opportunity was lost. To leave it untouched meant the message was declined. And if a man dared return it with the faintest brush of fingers against hers, well, that was an entire conversation no one else was allowed to hear. The rules extended to color and trim. White lace suggested innocence. Ivory hinted at mourning, though sometimes it masked flirtation under the guise of grief. Pale blue carried romantic connotations, pure yet daring. A red handkerchief, bold and unthinkable in polite company, belonged only to the reckless few who lived half outside the rules. And should a lady use her handkerchief to dab her lips before speaking, it was said she was preparing to tell a lie. Men, too, understood its codes. Gentlemen carried darker cloths, unadorned, meant for practical use, or so they claimed. A neatly folded handkerchief offered to a weeping woman was gallantry. To one who was not weeping, it could be indecent. A handkerchief pressed to the lips of a dying soldier might later be kept by his sweetheart for years, folded like grief itself. These small squares of cloth moved through life and death, recording more secrets than letters ever could. But the handkerchief was also an anchor of control. Women were expected to use it not just for gestures, but for containment, to muffle sneezes, coughs, even tears. A lady's emotion, wrote one etiquette author, should never exceed the limits of her handkerchief. It was, in essence, a portable boundary, soft, scented, and suffocating. Still, rebellion found its way between the stitches. Some women, embroidered initials, not of their husbands, but of lovers. Others hid tiny notes within the folds, fragments of poetry, promises, or directions to midnight meetings. In ballrooms shimmering with candlelight, handkerchiefs fell like snow, and a single glance decided which were meant to be retrieved and which were meant to be forgotten. By dawn, all were gathered, washed, and pressed again, their secrets scrubbed but not erased. They hung on drying lines like little ghosts of decorum, whispering to one another in the morning breeze. In a society where speech was dangerous, even silence found a way to flutter its wings. In Victorian England, grief was not a feeling, it was a calendar. The moment death entered a home, the clocks did not stop. They slowed into ritual. Mourning became a performance of devotion, governed by precise rules that turned sorrow into ceremony. There was a correct way to grieve, a proper shade of black to wear, a timetable for tears. To mourn too briefly was heartless. To mourn too long, indulgent. Respectability lay in moderation, even in despair. When a husband died, a widow's life was consumed by fabric. For the first year and a day, she was bound to full mourning heavy black crepe, dull as soot, absorbing light and sound alike. Jewelry was forbidden, except perhaps a locket containing a lock of hair from the deceased, worn close to the heart. Veils shrouded her face, their gauze thick enough to hide both tears and expression. Her footsteps softened to whispers, her laughter unthinkable. Even her correspondence carried black-edged paper, as if grief itself could be posted and returned. After 12 months, she might progress to half-mourning greys, lilacs and mauves, colors of fading sorrow. A ribbon could replace the veil. A single pearl might gleam where none had before. Society watched these transitions closely. To move on too quickly was indecent. To linger too long was morbid. Mourning, like everything else, was measured in appearances. Men's mourning was simpler, a black armband, a somber tie, perhaps a week of solemn demeanor before returning to the club. Children wore black sashes and recited prayers they scarcely understood. Servants, too, participated in their master's grief, their uniforms altered to reflect loss that was not their own. Death became a costume, tailored to class. Mourning infiltrated every corner of life. Streets filled with processions of black carriages and gloved pallbearers. Mourning photographers offered portraits of the newly dead posed as if asleep, preserving one final illusion of peace. Shops thrived on sorrow, selling jet jewelry and funeral stationery. Even etiquette books dictated conversation for the bereaved. One could discuss faith, but never the cause of death. Pain, though omnipresent, was to be polished, disciplined, and beautifully framed. And yet, behind the lace and crepe, grief still lived wild and wordless. A widow might remove her veil late at night and trace the air where her husband once stood. A mother might refuse to wash the child's last garment, keeping it folded by her bed. Letters went unanswered because the act of reading felt like reopening the grave. Some found comfort in seances, others in silence, all bound by the same unspoken truth. Mourning did not end when society said it should. When the year concluded and the colors returned, the widow re-entered the world like a ghost, learning to breathe. Her laughter sounded foreign, her reflection unfamiliar. The black dresses, now folded away, would remain in trunks for years, a wardrobe of memory. For the Victorians, grief was never healed, only hidden. The world moved on, but the air around the house still remembered who was missing. The first rule of widowhood was patience, not the kind born from serenity, but from surveillance. A Victorian widow was watched more closely than a queen. Every glance, every outing, every stitch of fabric she wore after her husband's death was an unspoken confession of loyalty or betrayal. The clock began ticking the moment the funeral ended, and society's eyes began to count the hours of her grief. For 12 months, she was to vanish into her mourning. She could attend no parties, visit no friends, and receive only the most solemn callers. Her letters were written on thick black-bordered stationery. Her windows remained curtained against the world. Even the sound of laughter within her home was considered indecent, as if joy itself were an act of infidelity. Her meals were taken in silence, her gowns of crepe so heavy they whispered grief with every step. The very fabric shed a fine soot that clung to her skin, leaving its mark like a shadow she could not wash away. But time, as it always does, began to move faster than permission. After a year and a day, her mourning could lessen. The colors lightened grey, mauve, lilac. Music returned cautiously to the drawing room. A waltz played softer than memory. The veil lifted. Yet still, she was not free. A smile could ignite gossip faster than scandal. An appearance at the theatre would summon whispers. A conversation with a man, even one her late husband had once called friend, could ruin her. The widow who forgets too soon, one etiquette column warned, forgets herself. It did not matter whether her marriage had been cruel, loveless, or brief. Her identity was no longer her own. She belonged to her mourning as surely as she once belonged to her husband. The creep was not costume, but cage, and so she learned to move carefully through her second year, still modest, still measured. At church, she lowered her eyes during hymns. At home, she kept his portrait polished and his pipe untouched. When neighbors visited, she spoke softly of his virtues, though in truth she had run out of new ones to invent. It was not devotion that kept her silent, it was survival. But some widows refused the script. They attended concerts in their lilac dresses. They accepted letters from men with steady hands and warm words. They began to live again quietly, but without apology. And when they did, the world recoiled. Newspapers printed moral essays, warning of the new widow and her dangerous disregard for propriety. She was accused of tempting fate, of dishonoring the dead, of turning grief into display. Late one night, long after her candles burned low, a widow might sit before her mirror and study the reflection the world forbade a woman who had endured both love and loss. Now neither saint nor sinner, her black dresses hung like ghosts in the wardrobe, watching as she dared to breathe. For the first time in months, she smiled not for society, but for herself. And though the hour was indecent, she did not look away. The dining room was the most disciplined room in the Victorian house, a theatre of manners, where appetite was disguised as elegance and conversation trimmed into decoration. By the time the silver domes were lifted and steam rose into the air, every person at the table already knew their lines. Supper was not nourishment, it was ceremony. The master of the house always entered first, his presence enough to still the clinking of cutlery. He took the head seat beneath the chandelier, his wife opposite, their children and guests arranged by rank and relation like pieces on a chessboard. Servants stood at attention along the wall, their faces blank as mirrors. The meal would begin only after the host's subtle nod, a gesture small enough to seem unintentional, but absolute in authority. Etiquette dictated everything: how the napkin was unfolded, which fork touched which dish, the angle of the knife upon the plate. A lady's wrist must never rise too high. A gentleman must never appear eager. The wrong motion could undo an evening's dignity. The proper pause between bites was 2 breaths. Conversation, when permitted, was to be gentle and bloodless. The weather, the Queen's health, perhaps a new volume of poetry, if it was not too passionate. To speak of money, illness, or emotion was considered barbaric. Even laughter had limits. A chuckle might pass, a hearty laugh would freeze the table. Silence, however, was safe. Silence was respect. The only true sound allowed was the faint chime of china and the rustle of linen as servants moved in ghost-like procession, replacing plates before they cooled. Every swallow echoed louder than it should. The room smelled of meat and candle wax, but no one dared admit they were hungry. Children, if invited at all, were expected to perform like ornaments, quiet, upright, attentive. A misplaced question could result in weeks of correction. Many learned to eat without appetite, to smile without warmth, to speak only when the pauses grew too heavy. Their parents called it refinement. It was, in truth, rehearsal, a lifetime's training in polite restraint. Outside these walls, taverns roared with laughter and unbuttoned shirts, the kind of noise that would horrify the drawing-room diners. Yet, even in their isolation, the well-bred envied something about that vulgar joy, something too alive to be imitated. A servant passing the open window might catch the echo of music from the street and suppress a smile before returning to the hush. When the final course arrived, pudding, wine, or silence itself, the master rose again, signaling the end. Chairs scraped softly, a chorus of restraint. The guests stood, thanked him for his hospitality, and filed out beneath the flickering chandelier. In their absence, the servants cleared the table, restoring the stillness brick by brick. By midnight, the house slept. The dining room lay empty, smelling faintly of roast and candle smoke, its silence perfectly folded once more. Tomorrow, it would all begin again, another supper, another performance, another night of words left unspoken. In Victorian England, the left hand was an object of quiet suspicion, a small, fleshy omen hiding in plain sight. To be left-handed was not merely unusual, it was unseemly. Manuals on child-rearing called it the sinister habit, echoing the Latin root sinistra, meaning unlucky, dark, or deceitful. Even the language betrayed its prejudice. The right hand was correct, proper, moral. The left hand belonged to whispers. Parents noticed early a child reaching for a spoon, a pencil, or a mother's hand with the wrong one. At first, they might laugh, dismissing it as childish confusion. But by school age, laughter turned to correction. Teachers tied ribbons around the left wrist to remind children which hand to avoid. Others tied the entire arm behind the back until obedience replaced instinct. The world, it seemed, preferred conformity to comfort. In the classroom, young pupils sat in neat rows, scratching ink with their awkward right hands, their fingers trembling over ruled paper. The desks themselves were built for the proper side ink wells and slants positioned to punish deviation. Left-handers smudged their work and blotted the page, earning scolds for carelessness. Some were struck on the knuckles until they learned the lesson. Normalcy required pain. The straightness of handwriting became proof of moral straightness too. At home, mothers corrected without cruelty, but with persistence. "Don't pass the bread with that hand," they'd murmur. "Use your right when greeting a guest." The correction became habit, and habit became identity. Over time, the left hand learned its place, the silent twin, capable but never trusted. Only in private did it move freely, turning pages, brushing hair, or tracing the window's condensation when no one watched. Religion deepened the shame. The Bible spoke of the righteous seated at God's right hand, while sinners were cast to the left. Sermons echoed this imagery, reinforcing what society already believed. The left was the side of error, temptation, and otherness. Superstitions grew around it. To enter a room left foot first was unlucky. To give or receive money with the left hand was rude. To eat with it was barbaric. The body itself was moralized until every gesture carried judgment. And yet, the human body remembers its truth. There were tailors who stitched more swiftly with their left hand, pianists who let it dominate the melody when no one noticed, painters who hid their natural reach behind graceful lies. Left-handedness survived in secret, not rebellion, just instinct that refused extinction. Late at night, when the household slept and the lamps dimmed to a faint amber glow, a child might sit at her desk, with her untied hand free at last. She would dip the pen into ink and write her name the way it felt natural, smooth and sure. For that brief moment, the word on the page looked alive, uncorrected, unashamed, entirely her own. Then, hearing footsteps in the corridor, she'd quickly switch hands again. The right one resumed its duty. The left returned to silence. When evening fell in the Victorian home, The first thing to move was the curtain, heavy brocade or damask, drawn with deliberate care, sealing the private world from the street. It was a gesture of modesty, yes, but also of fear. Behind those folds of fabric lay the one thing the Victorians could neither escape nor fully name: desire. Respectability depended upon opacity. Windows must never reveal what went on within. A passing neighbor catching a glimpse of an unguarded moment, a woman in her nightgown, a husband loosening his collar, would be scandal enough to stain a reputation for years. The home was sacred because it was unseen. To display affection, to hint at intimacy, was to invite judgment. The curtain became not just cloth, but conscience. Even within the household, privacy was rationed. Bedrooms for married couples were often separate, connected by a small door that could remain politely shut. The concept of togetherness was respectable only in 2507 conversation, not in proximity. When the time came for duty, for marriage to fulfill its unspoken purpose, the curtains were drawn again. This time, not from the window, but around the bed itself. 4 posts, heavy drapery, silence. The ritual was as much about concealment as it was about union. For women, ignorance was protection. Girls were told little of what awaited them after the wedding ceremony. Their virtue was to know nothing and endure everything. Mothers, bound by the same silence, offered only vague warnings cloaked in metaphors. The act itself was considered too indecent to describe. Physicians wrote of it clinically. Priests avoided it entirely, and husbands, even kind ones, rarely questioned the morality of what the world had taught them to expect. Desire, like disease, was spoken of only in whispers. Doctors labeled women who expressed pleasure as hysterical. Men were cautioned against excess, lest they drain their vital energy. The medical books of the time spoke of moderation, as though affection were an ailment to be managed. Curtains were drawn tighter, conversations gentler, and entire marriages passed without a single honest word about longing. Yet, inevitably, the human heart resisted the rules. In the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, the house itself seemed to exhale the tick of clocks softening, the air heavy with unspoken dreams. A wife might stand at her window, fingertips parting the curtain just enough to see the pale gaslight outside. The world beyond looked vast, alive, free. Somewhere out there, she imagined, people laughed without shame, touched without fear, breathed without restraint. Then, hearing her husband stir, she let the curtain fall once more. By morning, the folds would be straightened, the sunlight filtered just so. Breakfast would be served, voices calm, propriety restored. The world would go on believing that decency had triumphed over desire. But the dust on the curtain, catching the light, would betray the truth that passion had lived there all along, quietly waiting behind the velvet. No woman of breeding walked alone. In the eyes of Victorian society, the world beyond the doorstep was a battlefield of temptation and gossip, and the chaperone, often a mother, aunt, or hired companion, stood as both shield and warden. Her task was not only to protect a young lady's reputation, but to preserve the illusion that innocence required supervision. Virtue, after all, was valuable precisely because it was guarded. A proper chaperone knew her role was more than presence, it was vigilance. She attended every dinner, dance, and carriage ride, hovering just within earshot. Her parasol became an emblem of restraint, her silence a reminder that she was listening. At garden parties, she sat at the edge of conversation, pretending to admire the roses, while marking every glance exchanged between her charge and a potential suitor. Even laughter was monitored. One giggle too long could suggest impropriety. For young women, life was lived under constant observation. A walk through Hyde Park could happen only under a chaperone's gaze. A letter from a gentleman was to be read aloud before it could be answered. A dance at a ball might be granted, but only if her escort was deemed respectable by the matron in charge. Romance, if it existed at all, bloomed not in freedom but in the narrow corridors of etiquette. The flutter of a fan or the exchange of a calling card became acts of daring. To be without a chaperone was to risk ruin. A woman seen unaccompanied even in daylight could be mistaken for something she was not. Shopkeepers watched her differently. Men approached her boldly. The world, conditioned by suspicion, measured morality by company. One misstep, one rumor, one carriage ride without a guardian, and her name could be whispered in the same breath as scandal. Respectability was fragile. Once cracked, it could never be mended. Yet for all their vigilance, even chaperones were human. Some turned a blind eye when affection looked too sincere to suppress. Others, hardened by years of restraint, took pleasure in reminding their wards that life outside propriety was perilous. A rare few defied convention altogether, remembering what it felt like to have been young and silenced. These were the quiet allies, women who allowed a hand to linger a moment longer, who pretended not to notice when two hearts found courage enough to speak. Still, the system held. Society required its guardians, and women learned to navigate their presence like furniture, unavoidable, ornamental, and quietly oppressive. Courtship became a study in coded glances, in words chosen as carefully as steps in a waltz, and when love finally did find its place amid the vigilance, it felt less like discovery and more like triumph, a fragile victory wrestled from beneath a matron's watchful eyes. In the end, the chaperone's duty was to ensure that innocence survived, even at the cost of experience, and so she sat in drawing rooms and carriage seats, year after year, holding her parasol like a seal between freedom and consequence, guarding not the girl, but the world's opinion of her. There were girls who courted sunlight through glass. In the Victorian age, when a woman's reputation could shatter with a rumor, the window became her safest rebellion, the one place she could see the world without being seen. The parlor window, framed with lace and shadow, served as both cage and stage. Behind it, many romances began not with words, but with glances. In cities and small towns alike, the ritual unfolded daily. A young lady might take her embroidery to the window seat in the late afternoon, ostensibly for better light. Her mother, stationed discreetly in the next room, understood the purpose of this ritual but pretended not to. Across the street, a gentleman, a family acquaintance, perhaps, or a stranger who passed the same hour each day would tip his hat as he walked by. The moment was brief, careful, and thrilling in its restriction. It was affection dressed in etiquette, desire dressed in daylight. The Victorians perfected the art of pretending innocence. No meeting was ever spontaneous. It had to appear orchestrated by fate. A window glance was acceptable only if no words followed. If a man dared to send a note, it must arrive by post, addressed formally to the father, never directly to the daughter. But beneath those layers of politeness, entire relationships bloomed in silence. A raised curtain might signal consent. A shutter half closed could mean goodbye. They wrote in light and shadow because language was too dangerous. Poets and novelists of the era romanticized such scenes, the pale figure in lace curtains, the devoted man in the rain. But real life was lonelier. Many of these window brides, as gossip called them, never left their thresholds. They grew up confined by the moral architecture of the home, their worlds reduced to drawing rooms and corridors. To them, the view beyond the glass was freedom's mirror, close enough to touch, forever out of reach. In poorer streets, too, women watched from windows, seamstresses, widows, washerwomen, though not for courtship but for survival. They waited for customers, for the return of a husband, for news carried by strangers. Windows were their connection to a society that rarely looked back. A woman gazing too long into the street risked being judged as idle, or worse, wanton. Even solitude was suspect when performed by a woman. And yet, behind every lace curtain, humanity persisted. There were secret waves, shy smiles, messages written in breath against the glass. Love found its way, even through the frost. Some couples met this way for months before ever exchanging a word in person. When finally they did, in a park, under supervision, of course they spoke as if continuing a conversation already years old. By evening, the window would close, the lamp inside lit, turning the watcher into reflection. Her face hovered faintly in the glass, half in the world and half apart from it. For the Victorian woman, that was life. Itself seen but unseen, known only in fragments, forever waiting at the window. In Victorian England, morality disguised itself as medicine. The age worshipped science, yet feared the body, and so they studied it, not to understand it, but to tame it. Doctors, clergymen, and educators joined forces in a quiet alliance, to turn human nature into something measurable, respectable, and controllable. Decency, they insisted, could be taught like grammar, like posture, like prayer. Every movement of the body was pathologized. Too much laughter indicated nervous imbalance. Too little, melancholy. A blush betrayed emotional weakness. A yawn signaled moral decay. Manuals for healthy conduct filled the bookshops, prescribing how one should eat, breathe, and even think. Women, they said, possessed delicate nerves and must avoid excitement. Men were warned against self-indulgence in solitude, lest it weaken the mind and invite insanity. Virtue became a medical condition, vice a disease. Nowhere was this doctrine more invasive than in the home. Parents were urged to monitor their children's every habit, posture, appetite, bedtime thoughts. A boy who fidgeted too much at supper might be sent to the doctor for examination. A girl who daydreamed could be prescribed cod liver oil and confinement. The growing field of psychology, still young and uncertain, was harnessed not to free the spirit, but to police it. The human heart became a specimen under glass. Physicians wrote lectures warning women against overstimulation. Novels, music, and conversation were all considered dangerous to the female nervous system. Men of science filled libraries with treatises on how education might render women infertile, how imagination might lead to hysteria. The body was blamed for the soul's desires. In this era of rational progress, even morality was mechanized. And yet, the contradictions were everywhere. While moralists condemned passion, artists painted it in oil. While doctors lectured on purity, London's streets teemed with the commerce of desire. Every attempt to contain the body only made it more visible. The corset promised posture but revealed the shape it sought to conceal. The doctor prescribed restraint while the patient's pulse told a different truth. Respectability, that most fragile invention, cracked beneath its own scrutiny. Some few resisted. Reformers and thinkers, often women dismissed as eccentrics, began to question the so-called science of virtue. They spoke of education, autonomy, and the right to know one's own body. Their ideas were whispered at first, then published in pamphlets, then spoken aloud in parlors where curiosity outweighed fear. Each word was dangerous, but progress never announced itself politely. Still, the majority clung to their rules. They preferred the illusion of order to the risk of understanding, and so the doctor continued to prescribe morality. The priest continued to diagnose sin, and the drawing room continued to mistake repression for refinement. The age believed it had mastered human nature, not realizing it had only taught it how to hide. Behind every polite cough, every fainting spell, every studied silence, the pulse of the forbidden beat steadily on proof that no science could cure the heart of wanting. In Victorian England, a woman with a book was both fascinating and feared. Reading that quiet, harmless act was believed to carry a dangerous power, capable of unbinding the delicate threads of obedience and reason. A novel, left unattended on a lady's lap, might awaken thoughts better left dormant. The age worshipped literacy as a virtue, yet trembled at the sight of what it could do to a woman's mind once she began to think for herself. Parents encouraged their daughters to read scripture, etiquette manuals, and domestic guides, improving works that reinforced patience and piety. But fiction, especially by the likes of the Brontes or George Sand, was another matter. Those stories of yearning, independence, and passion were thought to excite the imagination to illness. Doctors wrote in journals that excessive reading could lead to hysteria, fainting fits, or most scandalous of all romantic dissatisfaction. In some homes, a daughter was forbidden from reading novels after dusk, lest her dreams become improper. Bookshops, meanwhile, flourished with contradiction. Shelves groaned under the weight of morality tracts and censored reprints. Yet behind the counter, clerks quietly sold the novels everyone claimed to despise. Servants borrowed them from lending libraries, governesses read them in secret, and young women tucked them behind embroidery frames, pretending to stitch while devouring tales of love and defiance. The novel became an accomplice, the first friend to tell them that feeling was not sin. Men, too, read, but their danger was different. Newspapers and philosophy might make them restless, discontented with the existing order. For the working classes, literacy offered a glimpse of power, and that frightened the ruling elite more than any crime. Education societies were praised in public and restricted in practice. Too much reading, it was whispered, gave the poor ideas. But it was the women readers who disturbed society most. They began to speak differently, to question sermons, to pity fallen characters rather than condemn them. A woman who quoted poetry risked being labeled odd, one who debated politics, unfeminine. Her eyes, once prized for their demureness, now looked awake. The simple act of turning pages became an act of rebellion, quiet and irrepressible. In drawing rooms, discussions arose about what kind of reading was safe. There were lists printed in ladies' magazines, the books suitable for the female mind. Volumes of moral essays and travel diaries purged of temptation. But the forbidden ones always found their way back into circulation, passed between friends, smuggled in hat boxes, their pages softened by shared hands. Late at night, when the lamps burned low and the rest of the house slept, a woman might sit by her window, her book open on her knees. The words shimmered in the candlelight, whispering possibilities too large for her narrow room. Somewhere, a floorboard creaked the sound of the world, reminding her to behave. She closed the book slowly, pressed her palm against the cover, and smiled. Tomorrow, she would read again. Confession, in Victorian England, did not belong to the church, it belonged to the parlour. It was not the priest who heard it, but society. The Victorians, terrified of true exposure, perfected a way of purging their feelings through decorum rather than honesty. They called it propriety, but in practice it was penance, the careful performance of virtue meant to disguise the restless storms within. Every act of life was an opportunity for moral theatre. Charity, for instance, was less about compassion than purification. A lady might visit the poor in silk gloves, handing out alms while breathing through lavender-scented cloth to shield herself from the odour of need. It was not cruelty. Exactly, it was fear. Poverty reminded the wealthy that decency was fragile, and sin contagious. The good deed became a barrier, not a bridge. In parlours across England, emotions were managed like household accounts, recorded, moderated, and neatly balanced. A woman might write letters of sympathy she did not feel, weep quietly for someone she scarcely knew, and feel absolved. Men confessed their anxieties to ledgers, to journals, to the slow ritual of smoking rooms. The Victorians believed that restraint was holiness, that controlling the soul's weather was a sign of civilization. Passion was not to be expressed, but aired gently, safely, until it evaporated. Even religion, that last refuge of honesty, was filtered through decorum. Hymns were sung softly, prayers were recited without fervor. The churches filled with polished pews and polite silence. Emotional excess, warned preachers, is a sign of spiritual weakness. Faith was intellectual, not ecstatic, a matter of posture, not of heart. Those who wept during worship were whispered about afterward. The soul was expected to behave, yet within these hushed lives, the need for release found strange outlets. People turned to journals, seances, temperance societies, and letter-writing clubs quiet, confessions hidden beneath respectability. Women shared moral essays with each other, weaving personal pain into metaphor. Men joined reform movements, disguising personal turmoil as civic duty. Even the rise of spiritualism, the tapping tables, the ghostly whispers was less about death than the living. It was permission, finally, to speak without being judged. Still, no curtain could fully contain the human voice. Late at night, in the privacy of locked bedrooms, the respectable sighed prayers that were not prayers at all, small fragments of truth whispered into the dark. A widow begging for courage, a husband wishing to escape his own authority, a daughter praying not for salvation, but for freedom. These were not sins, they were the quiet airings of suffocated souls. By morning, the windows opened again. The parlors were dusted, the letters burned, the smiles rehearsed. The world resumed its order, unaware of what had been released into the night. But the air inside those houses always felt different somehow, as if confession lingered there, invisible and unspoken, waiting for another evening when the soul might dare to breathe again. When the first gaslights flickered to life each evening, London exhaled a collective breath relief, safety, control. The lamps, bright against the fog, were not only symbols of progress but instruments of order. Beneath their pale glow, the city could see itself, disciplined and divided. To walk past 3 street lamps alone was, for a woman, to step beyond the boundary of respectability. To linger beneath one too long was to invite suspicion. Even light had morality. The street lamp rule, though never written, was understood by everyone. Proper women walked only where the lamps shone steady, in company or with a servant. Shadows were dangerous, the realm of thieves, beggars, and women whose names were whispered but not spoken. Mothers warned their daughters to stay within the halo of gaslight, as if virtue itself were measured in lumens. "Keep to the lamps," they said, "and you'll keep your good name." But reputation, like the light, could falter in an instant. The lamps hummed softly, their flames caged behind glass. They cast order upon the cobblestones, turning each block into a small stage of propriety. Couples strolled beneath them, careful not to walk too close. Gentlemen tipped their hats to passing ladies. Constables patrolled, their buttons glinting. And yet, between these golden circles lay alleys of darkness where the rules bent and vanished. There, the poor, the desperate, and the forgotten lived beyond the reach of civility. The lamps did not burn for them. For the middle and upper classes, light became performance. Evenings were planned around the glow theatre arrivals, carriage rides, promenades. A man escorting a lady home might walk her from lamp to lamp, ensuring her face was always illuminated and therefore beyond reproach. If the flame flickered or went out, he quickened his pace. The dark, in Victorian imagination, was not just danger, it was moral collapse. But the street lamps had a strange poetry too. They revealed what day concealed, the silver sheen of wet cobbles, the mist curling over rooftops, the soft reflection of flame in a puddle. Lovers found their courage there, standing just at the edge of the light where the world could half see them. A whispered confession beneath a lamp carried the thrill of defiance, the risk of being seen and the longing to be known. Light was both prison and promise. In the poorer quarters, where lamps were sparse, the night had its own rhythm. Market women packed their stalls by candle, chimney sweeps shared ale by the firelight of taverns, and children played until darkness swallowed the street. Their laughter was unchaperoned, unrefined, unpunished. The rich called those neighborhoods dangerous, the poor simply called them alive. By dawn, the lamps guttered out one by one, the hiss of gas fading into birdsong. The city yawned, bleary-eyed and self-satisfied, unaware of how many rules had been broken under its own illumination. For a few hours, before morning's scrutiny returned, even the most proper of souls had walked in shadow and perhaps, quietly, had liked it. The beauty of a Victorian woman was a perilous illusion. Layers of silk, whalebone, and poison stitched into elegance. To be fashionable in the 19th century was to court danger politely, smiling all the while beneath the weight of one's own attire. Every seam carried risk. Every shimmer could betray its secret cost. The dress did not simply adorn, it consumed. In the 1860s, green was the color of envy, youth, and prosperity. But the dye that gave it life, Sheely's green, was made from arsenic. Women wore it in gowns, gloves, even artificial flowers pinned in their hair. The dust of the pigment drifted onto their skin, their tea, their lungs. Seamstresses who worked the fabric coughed blood. Partygoers left balls faint and feverish. Still, the fashion persisted. "The shade is exquisite," wrote one society columnist, as if beauty excused decay. To wear that green was to announce refinement, even while dying from it. Corsets, too, exacted their price. Bones of whale and steel pressed against ribs until women could scarcely breathe. Waistlines shrank to impossible proportions. The body molded into submission. Doctors warned of fainting, displacement of organs. Even death, but propriety demanded endurance. A lady was expected to suffer silently, to faint gracefully rather than loosen her stays. Pain was elegance perfected. Then there was the crinoline, vast cages of wire and horsehair designed to make skirts balloon like clouds. They swept teacups from tables, trapped women in doorways, and, worst of all, caught fire with the ease of paper. Hundreds died when a stray spark from a hearth or candle met the airy circumference of fashion. Newspapers recorded it delicately. A tragic domestic accident. The truth was more brutal. Women burned alive. Their grace turned pyre. And yet, the obsession with beauty persisted. Entire industries thrived on danger disguised as refinement. Face powders contained lead, whitening the skin but corroding it beneath. Perfumes carried mercury. Hair tonics were brewed with ammonia. Even jewelry conspired against the body, jet mined in suffocating pits. Pearls coated in toxic varnish to preserve their shine. Every ornament was a quiet transaction between life and appearance. In private, some women rebelled. They loosened their corsets before bed, wore lighter gowns at home, allowed their lungs to expand without shame. Reformers began to speak of rational dress garments that allowed women to move, to breathe, to live. They were mocked at first, dismissed as radicals. But change, once named, began to stir. Still, for most, beauty remained worth the price. To be admired was to exist. A dress could kill, yes, but so could invisibility. And so the women continued to lace, to paint, to pose beneath chandeliers that smelled faintly of gas and arsenic. Beneath the glow, they glimmered like saints of suffering, radiant and fragile, their breath shallow but composed. No one could tell whether the shimmer on their skin was powder, sweat, or poison, only that it was beautiful. By the late 19th century, cleanliness had risen from habit to obsession. Soap advertisements promised salvation. Doctors preached purity as medicine. The Victorians, once accustomed to soot-stained hands and chamber pots, began to fear their own bodies. Dirt, they decided, was not just unseemly, it was sinful. To be clean was to be good. To smell of soap was to smell of virtue. Every household became a laboratory of hygiene. Bathrooms, once rare luxuries, multiplied among the wealthy, tiled in gleaming white to imitate hospitals. New plumbing allowed the rich to summon water at will, a miracle of progress that doubled as a moral test. To bathe daily proved not only health, but refinement. For the poor, who still drew water from communal pumps, filth became a mark of shame, evidence of moral decay rather than circumstance. The gulf between cleanliness and class widened with every scrubbed floor. Mothers drilled hygiene into their daughters as a measure of worth. A spotless gown, a polished shoe, a linen collar unstained by sweat. These were credentials of decency. Advertisements for Pears soap and carbolic powder blurred health with holiness. Godliness is next to cleanliness. the slogans promised. Women became the priests of this new domestic religion, their wash basins altars, their sponges instruments of redemption. Yet the cult of purity soon turned inward. Doctors warned that dirt was not only on the skin but in the soul, that vice, like disease, spread through invisible contagion. The language of morality became medical: corruption, infection, contamination. The sinner and the unwashed were treated with the same horror. Even emotion was subject to purification. Children were told not to touch their faces, not to cry, not to play too roughly lest they soil their disposition. The body's natural impulses, sweat, tears, breath, became things to conceal. Ironically, the cleanest homes often hid the sickest hearts. Behind starched curtains, wives fainted from overuse of carbolic acid, servants coughed from the fumes of bleach, soap powders burned the skin raw, and purified air reeked of ammonia. Germ theory, only newly understood, was twisted into paranoia. Mothers scrubbed their children until their cheeks blushed not from health but from abrasion. Cleanliness became compulsion. And still the advertisements sang, smiling infants in bathtubs, angels of hygiene glowing with light. To be spotless was to be safe, to be accepted, to belong. The working poor, seeing these images, chased the same purity with cheaper soaps, harsher chemicals, colder water. The entire nation washed as though redemption could be found at the bottom of a basin. By evening, London smelled of lavender and disinfectant. The rivers gleamed with suds, the air tinged with lime and steam. A lady might lie in her freshly laundered bed, skin tingling, lungs sharp with carbolic vapor, and whisper a small prayer that she was now clean, clean enough to be worthy of love, of heaven, of simply existing. Outside, the city's filth rolled on as always, unseen beneath the illusion of purity. Death, in Victorian England, was not an end but a performance, an event to be managed, adorned, and observed with the same precision as a wedding or dinner party. To die properly was an art, and to mourn correctly, a duty. From the moment a final breath escaped a body, the machinery of etiquette began to turn. Even grief had its grammar. The first act was preparation. The mirrors were covered, the clocks stopped, the curtains drawn. The deceased was washed, perfumed, and dressed as if for company. Women were swathed in lace or crepe, men in black suits with crisp collars. Coins pressed beneath eyelids kept them politely closed. Death, no matter how messy or sudden, was to appear orderly, the soul's departure, sanitized for the eyes of the living. Servants moved silently through the halls, their black armbands tight around their sleeves. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Then came the visitors. Calling cards arrived like rain, each one bearing condolences written in slanted ink. The drawing room filled with low voices and rustling skirts as neighbors came to perform their sympathies. A widow might faint softly into her handkerchief. A child might be told not to cry too loudly. Sorrow was permitted, but only in the correct proportions. Tears were ladylike, wailing was vulgar. The funeral was the grand display, a procession of plumed horses, carriages, and mourners dressed to match the hierarchy of loss. Black parasols bloomed like ink blots along the street. Poorer families, unable to afford such spectacle, often went into debt to maintain the illusion of dignity. Respectability, even in death, could not be compromised. Coffin makers and mourning suppliers thrived, offering grief packages that promised the perfect farewell. There were gloves for pallbearers, ribbons for flowers, even mourning stationery with borders the color of shadow. Graveyards, too, obeyed etiquette. The wealthy dead were interred beneath ornate marble angels and wrought iron fences, their epitaphs proclaiming virtue. The poor rested beneath plain stones, often shared by several souls, yet expected to be just as humble in eternity as they had been in life. Sunday visitors walked the cemetery paths like promenades, reading inscriptions and admiring floral arrangements. Death, made elegant, became almost fashionable, yet beneath the choreography lay fear. Victorians were haunted by the possibility of dying badly unshriven, unattended, unclean. Doctors wrote anxiously about premature burial. Inventors designed coffins with escape bells for those feared not truly dead. The afterlife, they hoped, would be as orderly as their parlors, with angels performing their duties and heaven as neat as an English garden. When the final guest left, and the house fell still again, the family resumed its careful mourning. Black crape adorned the mirrors once more. At night, the widow might rise and walk the hall, her footsteps muffled by carpet, her fingers trailing along the closed doors. In the dark, the rituals of etiquette fell away. Grief, finally unobserved, was not graceful but human, and that was something no rule-book could contain. In a world where every word was weighted with consequence, the Victorian letter was both weapon and confession. The inked page could lift a person into respectability or sink them into ruin. Paper, more than passion, defined reputation. Every household kept stationery pressed with family crests and mottos, as though nobility could be written into existence. Yet for all its ceremony, the wax seal, the tidy script, the ritual of folding the letter remained dangerous. Once sent, it could never be recalled. A lady might spend hours composing a single note, her gloved hand trembling above the paper. The phrasing had to be exact, neither too cold nor too familiar. My dearest sir could sound improper. Esteemed Mr. too distant. Even the slant of handwriting mattered. Too elegant, and she risked being called flirtatious. Too plain, and she appeared uneducated. A letter was not conversation, it was performance, frozen in ink. The post was swift and merciless. Deliveries arrived twice daily, carrying gossip faster than whispers could travel. Servants sorted the envelopes, eyes lowered, but none were blind to what they carried. A perfumed note delivered to the wrong address could topple a household. A missing reply could end an engagement. The Victorians spoke little in public, but on paper, their hearts bled cautiously, eloquently, fatally. Scandal often began with the smallest mistake, a misplaced comma, a signature too intimate, a confession written in haste. There are stories of letters found years later, yellowed and trembling in the hands of those they betrayed, a widow discovering her husband's correspondence with another woman, a governess dismissed for a single unchaperoned paragraph, a young man's declaration intercepted by a father who read it aloud at breakfast. The postman, silent and dutiful, became the unintentional keeper of tragedies. Love letters were the most perilous. They were cherished, kissed, hidden in drawers lined with lace and feared. Some women burned them immediately after reading, watching the words curl into smoke. Others tied them with ribbons, storing them like relics, unable to destroy what had once made them feel alive. Yet even the most discreet reader knew the risk. Fire might preserve virtue, but memory would never obey. Etiquette manuals advised against all written intimacy. Say nothing on paper, they warned, that you would blush to hear read aloud. Still they wrote because silence was worse. The letter became a rebellion against the world's supervision, a place where people could speak freely, if only to the page. It was the one form of touch society could not chaperone, and so they continued, night after night, beneath lamplight, writing the words they could never say aloud. When the final line dried and the wax hardened, they hesitated before the postbox, that black iron mouth that swallowed confessions whole. The letter slipped in, light as breath, heavy as fate. By morning, it was no longer theirs. It belonged to rumor, to risk, to the vast machinery of consequence that ruled the age. Before a Victorian child learned to speak, they learned to sit. Posture was not simply deportment, it was destiny. Straight backs and still hands were the foundations of moral character. A curved spine suggested weakness, a slouch, moral decay. In an era obsessed with appearances, the body became a billboard of virtue. How one stood, walked, and even tilted, the head reflected the supposed state of the soul. In drawing rooms and classrooms alike, posture was policed with near-religious fervor. Governesses and tutors carried thin rods to correct the errant shoulders of pupils. "Sit up, dear, the spine is the ladder to heaven," one manual declared. Children practiced for hours, balancing books upon their heads, their necks stiff as porcelain. Mothers corrected them between stitches of embroidery, reminding them that refinement was visible long before it was spoken. Even dolls, sold in the likeness of society's ideal girls, were molded upright, their plastic smiles locked in, perfect composure. For women, posture was both performance and prison. Corsets sculpted the body into an elegant shape, forcing the shoulders back and the chest forward, until breath itself became an act of discipline. To lean too far in conversation was forwardness, to recline too deeply, laziness. Men were taught a different rigidity, upright, square, commanding. They were to stand as if the empire itself rested on their shoulders. The act of sitting became a map of social hierarchy. The poor hunched from labor, the rich elongated from leisure. Even illness had etiquette. A woman fainting from her corset must collapse gracefully, hand raised to the brow, avoiding any unseemly sprawl. Convalescents were instructed to recline modestly, as if sickness too should maintain decorum. Hospitals filled with patients trained to endure pain quietly, their bodies taught not just to heal but to behave. Posture extended beyond the body into morality. "Keep your back straight," mothers told their daughters, meaning, do not yield, do not feel too deeply, do not draw attention. The moralists believed a rigid spine signified inner control, that those who stood tall could resist temptation. But behind the facade, the human frame rebelled. Bones warped, lungs strained, muscles ached from the weight of all that restraint. Still, society admired the illusion. Portraits of the era show families arranged like architecture. Not one head bowed, not one knee bent. The physical self was sculpted into a monument of order, and pain was the mortar that held it in place. The discipline of the body became a quiet metaphor for the discipline of the mind, both meant to suppress the wildness of being alive. And yet, in private moments late at night, long after the candles had burned low, one might find a lady leaning forward, resting her elbows on the table, or a gentleman slouched in his chair, tie loosened, spine released. For a few precious minutes, they allowed their bodies to remember themselves. Then came the sound of footsteps in the hall, and posture, like composure, returned. The spine straightened, the breath shallowed, and the performance began anew. Respectability, in Victorian England, was both crown and chain. To possess it was to belong, to lose it was to vanish. Every man and woman, rich or poor, lived within its invisible walls, measuring each word, gesture, and glance against the cold gaze of public opinion. It was not morality that ruled the age, but reputation, a fragile construction built from silence, restraint, and fear. The rules of this prison were unwritten but absolute. A man could recover from bankruptcy, but not from scandal. A woman could survive poverty, but not a whisper about impropriety. Neighbors watched each other's curtains, counted the frequency of church attendance, and noted the arrival time of visiting carriages. Gossip was the currency of control, traded freely, wielded ruthlessly. The most dangerous thing a person could do was to be noticed. Within this constant scrutiny, the self began to shrink. People learned to live as reflections of others' expectations, their true thoughts buried beneath layers of politeness. Even joy required permission. Laughter too loud, tears too visible, affection too sincere, all marked one as suspect. Families rehearsed harmony at breakfast tables, marriages were maintained for appearances, and friendships ended the moment rumor touched them. Everyone played their part in the grand theater of virtue, terrified of missing a cue. Respectability demanded not only purity, but distance. To associate with anyone who had fallen from grace, a divorced woman, an artist with radical ideas, a man rumored to drink too freely, was to risk contagion. compassion became cowardice. A family could disown its own blood to preserve its name. Mothers who forgave too easily were branded naive. Daughters who disobeyed were cast out. The church, the press, and the dinner party all enforced the same sentence: isolation for those who dared to live honestly. And yet, behind closed doors, hypocrisy thrived. The same gentlemen who preached virtue kept mistresses in rented rooms. The same women who condemned impropriety sent anonymous letters to scandal sheets. Charity galas, funded by moral crusaders, were whispered to be excuses for flirtation. The greater the appearance of virtue, the deeper the secrets it concealed. Respectability did not cleanse, it concealed. For the poor, the prison was harsher still. A single mother, a fallen servant, a laborer who lost his job, all were condemned not just by circumstance, but by character. Society called them undeserving, as if misfortune itself was sin. Even the charitable inspected the morals of the needy before offering help. Clean hands were a prerequisite for bread. Still, a quiet rebellion simmered. Writers mocked hypocrisy in novels. Painters portrayed truth in scandalous honesty. Women gathered in parlors to discuss suffrage. Workers formed unions beneath the watchful eyes of factory owners. The first cracks appeared in the walls. But for most Victorians, the fear of disgrace outweighed the hunger for freedom. Respectability promised safety, a life untarnished by rumor, if not untouched by loneliness. It was a bargain many made willingly, even as they suffocated within it. The prison doors, after all, were made of glass, transparent, fragile, and impossible to escape without breaking the illusion completely. No one saw it happen, yet everyone felt it. The slow, invisible rebellion that crept through the great houses of Victorian England, not with fire or weapons, but with silence, subtlety, and memory. The servants, who moved like shadows through corridors and parlors, had begun to turn observation into power. They knew every habit, every secret, every hypocrisy that polished society tried to hide. They were the watchers behind the curtain, the true chroniclers of respectability. Each household ran on their labor, yet they existed in its margins. Servants were to be invisible by day and unheard by night. Their meals were taken apart, their laughter suppressed, their names remembered only when something went wrong. A broken teacup, a wrinkled bedsheet, a delayed letter, all could erase years of service, yet beneath the humility lay quiet authority. The butler knew the debts hidden behind the master's confident smile. The lady's maid saw the bruises beneath the lace. The coachman overheard what was said in carriages after midnight. In a world obsessed with propriety, knowledge became the one weapon they were permitted to hold. Servants spoke rarely, but they listened always. They memorized the tones of arguments through closed doors, the rhythms of footsteps on the stairs, the hours when certain rooms were entered and left. Gossip, in their hands, was both shield and sword. A rumor planted discreetly among other households could shift reputations, rearrange alliances, even settle old humiliations. It was revenge of the softest kind, nothing that could be proven, but everything that could be felt. Still, not all vengeance was spoken. Sometimes it arrived in the smallest acts of rebellion. A misplaced letter, a forgotten message, a gown stitched a fraction too tight, a spoonful of sugar replaced with salt, a lock of hair snipped too short, a moment's pause before answering the bell. These gestures went unnoticed by masters too absorbed in their own importance, yet they carried a satisfaction sharper than confession. Every disobedience, however small, was a reminder that servitude was never truly submission. Among themselves, in the servant halls and kitchens below the glittering rooms, stories circulated freely: the mistress's vanity, the master's weakness, the hypocrisies of their betters, all retold with laughter and irony. Here, among the smell of starch and coal, the world turned upside down. Titles lost their weight, money its majesty. Truth lived downstairs, while fiction reigned above. Some servants left their posts to write novels or memoirs. thinly disguised tales that exposed the world they once polished. Others simply carried their knowledge like an inheritance, passing it on through generations of quiet defiance. They were the invisible historians of an age built on pretense, and when the master's bell rang, they still answered calm, polite, unshaken. Yet somewhere, deep inside, they knew what the world did not, that the empire of manners stood not on virtue but on their silence, and if that silence ever chose to break, the walls of every grand house in England would tremble with the truth it had tried so hard to hide. Every Victorian home had one room that mattered more than all the others, the parlour. It was not for comfort, nor for living, but for display. The parlour was the soul of the household, dressed in velvet and varnish, a place where respectability sat in judgment. To enter, it was to step onto a stage, where every object, colour, and silence testified to one's moral worth. Visitors rarely saw the rest of the house, not the cold scullery where servants scrubbed dishes, nor the cramped bedrooms where children whispered in the dark. They saw only the parlour, and that was enough. It told them everything society demanded to know: the family's taste, its income, its self-control, wallpaper patterns, curtain fabrics, and the alignment of furniture all spoke a secret language of status. To the trained Victorian eye, even a vase could betray a character flaw. The air inside was heavy with polish and pretense. Flowers arranged in symmetrical perfection. Family portraits gazing down in muted virtue. A piano waiting in the corner, its keys untouched except when guests arrived. Each object had been placed not for pleasure but for impression. To sit there was to perform stillness, hands folded, back straight, smile faint. The very temperature of the room seemed to discourage spontaneity. Laughter sounded too loud. Sighs echoed like confession. The parlour was also the scene of courtship, condolence, and social transaction. Suitors were received there under a mother's watchful eye. Condolences were offered after funerals, each sorrow measured in tone and phrasing. It was a room of ritualized emotion, where the heart learned to whisper behind velvet drapes. Even grief had to match the decor. A black ribbon on the piano, a mourning card on the mantel, enough to convey respect, not enough to disturb composure. But for the women who ruled it, the parlour was both kingdom and cage. The mistress of the house spent hours ensuring every cushion and ornament spoke well of her family's virtue. She dusted the furniture with devotion, rearranged books to display intellect, placed a Bible in sight but never too near the edge piety without zeal. Her reputation lived within those walls. Should a visitor find dust, faded fabric, or an improperly lit fire, it was not the servant who was judged, but the woman of the house herself. Cleanliness was her character, ornament her morality. And yet, when night fell and the guests were gone, the parlour lost its voice. The air grew still. The curtains breathed faintly with draughts from the chimney. Sometimes a candle burned longer than it should, its flame bending as if listening to the silence it had helped create. The mistress, passing by, might pause at the doorway and gaze into the polished emptiness, a room that looked back at her with the same silent scrutiny it offered everyone else. For all its grandeur, the Victorian parlour was not a place to live, but to be seen living a shrine to appearances, where respectability itself sat enthroned, waiting to be admired. In the Victorian home, time was not a background hum, it was authority. The clock ruled with brass hands and a moral conscience, its tick echoing through parlours, kitchens, and bedrooms alike. To live respectably was to live punctually. Each hour announced itself like a sermon, dividing the day into proper segments of industry and restraint. The Victorians believed that goodness could be measured in minutes, that a person who managed time well managed the soul as well. The grand clock in the hallway was the household's beating heart. It was polished weekly, wound with ritual, and rarely, if ever, allowed to stop. Servants rose by its chime before dawn. Children studied by its rhythm. Dinners were served precisely on the quarter. Late was not merely impolite, it was a moral defect. To keep someone waiting suggested arrogance. To rush suggested carelessness. In a world obsessed with order, timekeeping became the quiet tyranny that kept everyone in their place. Manuals of domestic conduct prescribed schedules for every class. A gentleman's day began with correspondence and ended with reflection. A lady's with sewing and silence. Even leisure was scheduled. 10 minutes for tea, 1 hour for a stroll, half an hour of reading approved literature before bed. The notion of spontaneity was suspect a symptom, perhaps, of poor discipline. To lose track of time was to lose the self. Factories and railways amplified this worship of precision. The new industrial clock towered over cities, dictating not only labor, but morality. Railway time synchronized the nation, replacing local rhythms with mechanical exactness. People learned to trust the clock more than their instincts the sun could deceive, but gears did not. The empire itself seemed powered by punctuality. Order at home mirrored order abroad, and yet, behind the ticking, life strained against the gears. Housewives counted the seconds until their husbands returned. Servants prayed for the shift to end. Children measured eternity in minutes before bedtime. Time moved with perfect indifference, marking not progress, but repetition. The clock's hands turned, and with them, the endless rituals of duty, dusting, serving, smiling, enduring. At night, when the household slept, the ticking grew louder. It filled the corridors, an unrelenting reminder that even rest was borrowed. A sleepless woman might lie in bed listening to it, each click a pulse of anxiety. She would think of all she had done that day, and all she must do again tomorrow. The clock judged her without mercy, its rhythm whispering too slow, too idle, too late. Sometimes, the mechanism faltered, the spring wound too tight. The pendulum stilled. In that sudden silence, the house seemed to breathe for the first time. But habit demanded restoration. Someone would hurry to fix it, to make the ticking return. Peace, after all, was unsettling. The Victorians feared what they could not measure, and so the clock resumed its sermon, unblinking, unfeeling, the metronome of a society terrified of its own pause. Pain, in the Victorian age, was not to be expressed but endured elegantly, quietly, and preferably out of sight. The more stoic the patient, the higher the praise. Whether it was childbirth, heartbreak, or the slow decay of illness, suffering was treated as proof of moral strength. The loudest virtue was silence. In polite society, anguish had to dress itself in grace. A lady could faint, but she must never cry out. A gentleman could limp from gout or consumption, but he must joke lightly about the weather. To admit despair was a breach of decorum. To display it, a scandal. Even grief was measured, restrained into acceptable gestures, a bowed head, a trembling hand, quickly steadied. The Victorians admired composure the way others admired courage. They mistook repression for character. Doctors encouraged this discipline. Pain, they said, refined the spirit. Women were instructed to bear childbirth without complaint, their screams muffled behind closed doors while men waited downstairs with brandy. Patients undergoing surgery in the years before reliable anesthesia were urged to stay still, to endure bravely for the sake of dignity. To cry or flinch was to shame one's family. The sickbed became a stage, and fortitude the only applause allowed. At funerals, the same rule held. Tears were wiped away swiftly, sobs swallowed before they left the throat. A widow who broke down publicly was pitied less for her loss than for her lack of discipline. The correct grief was silent, internal, managed. Public displays of emotion were for the lower classes. It was said for those too uneducated to hide themselves. In parlors filled with mourning crepe, the air was heavy not with weeping but with restraint. Behind closed doors, however, the silence cracked. Women wept into pillows at night, muffling their cries in case the servants heard. Men found release in brandy or the privacy of smoking rooms. Children learned early that pain should be hidden, a scraped knee cleaned without tears. a broken toy repaired without complaint. In a culture that glorified endurance, compassion became secondary. Sympathy was offered in platitudes, not presents. Writers of the time hinted at the cost. The novels of the era are full of women dying quietly, men wasting away with polite resolve, children fading like candle flames. Their heroism was not in survival but in serenity. The reader was meant to admire their restraint, never question the cruelty that demanded it. Real life followed fiction's example, and yet, in rare moments of honesty, a bedside whisper, a diary entry never meant to be read, the truth emerges. Beneath the polished surfaces of Victorian composure lay oceans of exhaustion, fear, and longing to be understood. The silence that had been mistaken for strength was, in truth, suffocation. Still, the world applauded their quiet courage. The clock ticked, the house slept, and the wounded, physical or otherwise, endured another night without a sound. In the morning, they rose again, faces calm, collars starched, hearts aching in perfect, admirable silence. Behind the glittering facades of Victorian London, where the streets hummed with the bustle of respectability, there were places where the rules were bent, ignored, or broken entirely. These were the secret rooms, hidden beneath the weight of propriety, where lives were lived that society could neither see nor accept. And in these rooms, beneath the lamps that never flickered in the drawing rooms above, the true heart of the city pulsed, unpolished, uncontained, and undeniably human. It was in these secret spaces that the poor, the discarded, and the silenced sought refuge. The slums of Whitechapel, the alleys near Covent Garden, and the back streets of Soho offered an escape from the ever-watchful eyes of the upper class. Here, the rules that governed behavior in the parlor were stripped away. A woman could smoke, laugh, and love without the weight of judgment. A man could exist in ways that were never permitted in the drawing rooms and clubs of Mayfair. It was also in these rooms that the shadows of Victorian society's deepest hypocrisies took shape. Brothels flourished, their doors shut to the respectable world, yet their clientele walked the streets in broad daylight. Homosexuality, though criminalized, found secret meeting places where men could touch and be touched in quiet, hidden corners of the city. Opium dens beckoned the curious and the desperate alike, offering oblivion beneath smoke-filled ceilings. Yet these spaces were not purely places of vice, they were also places of survival. The unspoken rule of the hidden room was that everyone, from the poorest prostitute to the wealthiest thief, understood the need for discretion. They spoke the same language, one of survival, secrecy, and the quiet power of silence. If you asked them why they sought refuge in the shadows, they would tell you it was simply the only place where they could truly live. The women of these rooms were especially invisible. Prostitutes, mistresses, and actors of the stage, who lived beyond the walls of marriage and respectability. In the streets, they wore their shame like a veil, but behind closed doors, they became queens of their own domain, their laughter echoing in the parlors that society had deemed unworthy. They were not idle, they were alive, taking what joy they could in a world that denied them everything else. Even the criminals of London lived within these secret spaces. Their crimes were not committed with malice, but with desperation. The poor and the hungry forced into acts that the respectable classes could never understand. Thefts and cons were no different than the transactions of the upper classes, where wealth was won with an exchange of wit rather than of coin. The criminals of the secret rooms were simply a reflection of society's own contradictions. They, too, were just looking for a place to belong. And in the silence of those rooms, away from the watchful eyes of the city, a strange peace existed. Not because the rules were absent, but because they were understood. Here, there was freedom, not the freedom to be anything, but the freedom to be nothing. The room, closed and hidden, was both refuge and prison. The city above continued to breathe its perfectly orchestrated life. But beneath the surface, in the hidden chambers of London, another world persisted, raw, unrefined, and real. By the final decades of the 19th century, the iron grip of Victorian morality had begun to rust. The same society that had built its empire on manners and modesty found itself sinking into the very excess it once condemned. Decency, once preached like scripture, had become spectacle. Respectability, so long paraded as virtue, began to smell faintly of rot. It started quietly. The parlors that once hosted polite conversation began to fill with gossip of scandals too numerous to hide. A duke caught in a gambling house, a bishop's letters found in a brothel, a beloved actress revealed to have borne a child in secret. The newspapers, newly liberated by technology and greed, fed the public every lurid detail. Morality had become entertainment. Readers tutted and gasped, but they read on eagerly, their outrage indistinguishable from fascination. The age that prized restraint had learned to consume corruption with decorum. The streets told the same story. London's fog grew thicker, not only with coal smoke but with contradiction. Opulence and poverty coexisted door to door, satin gowns brushing against starving children, perfume mingling with sewage. The empire's wealth flowed through drawing rooms lined with imported ivory and silk, even as the workers who mined and wove them coughed in darkened factories. The world above grew ever more polished, while the one below decayed. Yet both relied on the other to survive. The body, too, betrayed the lie. Decency demanded denial of hunger, of lust, of emotion, but repression found its revenge. Doctors wrote discreetly of nervous exhaustion, hysteria, and melancholia, the asylums filled with women who had lost control, and men whose tempers cracked beneath the weight of perfection. London's pharmacies sold tonics promising to calm the nerves, while opium dens and gin houses did the same without apology. Behind lace curtains, addiction bloomed like mold. Even architecture seemed complicit. The great city of spires and marble facades hid tenements where disease spread faster than the gas lamps could burn it away. In those hidden districts, life was brief, brutal, and forgotten. Yet the respectable world needed them to sew their dresses, to clean their soot, to die quietly so others might live comfortably. Decay had become the foundation of elegance, and still, society refused to look inward. Instead, it doubled down on the performance. Etiquette books multiplied, reform movements flourished, sermons thundered against vice. The harder the world tried to appear moral, the more it revealed its corruption. Virtue became costume, compassion, rhetoric, decency no longer illuminated, it concealed. By century's end, the cracks could no longer be ignored. The empire trembled under its own contradictions. The same hand that held the prayer book also signed the contract of exploitation. The same lips that preached purity whispered scandal in drawing rooms. The smell of lavender could not disguise the scent of decay. And as the final Victorian winter settled over London, the city, magnificent, monstrous, moral to the end, shivered beneath its own perfection, unsure whether the rot began in its slums or its soul. By the twilight of the Victorian age, the silence began to break. Somewhere between the creak of corsets and the whisper of lace, women began to breathe differently, deeper, louder, unafraid. The rules that had defined their existence for decades started to crumble, not with rebellion's roar, but with the quiet certainty of exhaustion. They had bowed long enough. It began in drawing rooms, not battlefields. A widow refused to wear mourning longer than she wished. A daughter declined to marry the suitor her family had chosen. A governess demanded wages equal to her labor. Small acts, at first personal, invisible, but like hairline fractures in glass, they multiplied. Magazines written by women began to circulate essays on education and autonomy. Suffragist meetings, once whispered about in disapproval, found audiences eager to listen. The word freedom was still dangerous, yet its echo reached even the parlor walls. Fashion, always the first to rebel, loosened before society did. Corsets relaxed their grip. Skirts grew shorter by a fraction each year. The aesthetic reformers preached a new gospel: comfort as dignity, movement as morality. Bicycles appeared on London streets, carrying women in divided skirts who refused to apologize for the scandal of motion. Their laughter, open, unrestrained, was louder than any sermon. The city blinked, unsure whether to stare or follow. The press, predictably, mocked them. The new woman, the papers called her a caricature of trousers and defiance, portrayed as monstrous, unfeminine, dangerous to home and hearth. Yet behind the satire was fear. For the first time, the social order felt unsteady. Husbands who had been accustomed to authority found themselves questioned at breakfast. Clergymen preached harder, politicians scoffed louder. But progress, once set in motion, cannot unlearn its own direction. In factories and schools, the movement grew bolder. Working women organized for safer conditions and better pay. Teachers demanded entry into universities. Writers published under their own names instead of initials. The fight was still uneven. Many were ridiculed, dismissed, or imprisoned, but the air had shifted. Respectability no longer frightened them. Even among the privileged, the old decorum began to feel absurd. Women who had once filled their days with embroidery and polite suffering took to lectures and charity boards, wielding influence in places they'd been forbidden to enter. Mourning veils lifted sooner, smiles widened without apology, and parlors once dedicated to gossip now echoed with debate. And yet, rebellion came not from hatred of men, but from hunger for self. These women did not seek to overthrow the world, only to live fully within it. They wanted to speak without permission, to laugh without fear, to stand without bowing. For the first time, they demanded to be seen not as ideals, but as individuals. By the century's end, the empire that had prized obedience began to sense its daughters slipping from its grasp. Some called it decline, others awakening. Either way, the bow had been broken. The age of whispering women was ending, and a new century, noisier, freer, and far less polite, was waiting at the door. By the 1890s, a quiet uprising had settled into the bones of England, not an army, not a revolution, but an awakening. Women who had been trained to lower their eyes and fold their hands began to stand taller, to look directly at the world that had kept them bent. They were the daughters of governesses, seamstresses, widows, and countesses alike, all bound by the same invisible leash. And one by one, they began to slip it. They called her the new woman. The papers mocked her as reckless and unladylike. Cartoons showed her smoking cigarettes, riding bicycles, reading scandalous novels, or worst of all, speaking her mind. But beneath the ridicule was terror. For every jest about short hair or divided skirts, there was an unspoken fear that the entire social order might collapse if women simply stopped obeying. The rebellion was not loud. It was measured, intelligent, deliberate, the kind that made those in power most uneasy. Women began to demand education, not as a privilege, but as a right. Universities, long fortified against them, began to yield grudgingly, then irreversibly. They became doctors, clerks, teachers, journalists. Even in factories, women formed unions, arguing that if they could endure 14-hour shifts in air thick with lint and smoke, they could surely endure equality. At home, the rebellion looked quieter, but no less radical. A wife refused to surrender her inheritance to her husband. A mother taught her daughters arithmetic instead of embroidery. A young woman read a newspaper in public, an act so small it seemed laughable, until one realized how long the world had forbidden her gaze. The simplest gestures, standing, speaking, deciding, became declarations of independence. And yet, this freedom was costly. Women who sought divorce were branded immoral. Those who lived alone were whispered about in church pews. The suffragists who marched for the vote were pelted with rotten vegetables, beaten by police, jailed, and force-fed through tubes. Still, they returned to the streets, their white dresses stained with defiance. They sang hymns not to God, but to the future. In parlors once ruled by lace and etiquette, the conversations changed. The daughters who had once served tea in silence now debated socialism, science, and philosophy. Mothers who had once enforced propriety began to question it. Even the furniture of domestic life, the parlor chairs, the tea sets, the mirrors, seemed to watch the transformation with unease. The Victorian ideal of womanhood, polished and passive, was cracking beneath the weight of reality. As the century turned, London itself began to shift. The gas lights still burned, but their glow fell on a different world. The women walking the streets no longer looked down. They moved with purpose, skirts brushing cobblestones like the rustle of wind before a storm. The empire, so sure of its order, trembled slightly, as if realizing that its most loyal subjects had learned to stand without permission. And somewhere, in a quiet parlor on an ordinary street, a woman folded her hands, looked toward the door, and smiled. She did not bow. She did not wait. She simply rose and stepped forward. By the closing years of the Victorian era, the weight of rules that had governed life for generations had begun to crumble like old plaster. The careful etiquette that had dictated how one walked, spoke, and breathed left its residue on every home, every street, every mind, a fine, almost invisible dust. It settled on furniture, curtains, and skin alike, coating the world with expectation. And like dust, it could not be entirely removed, only stirred, inhaled, and remembered. The parlor, once the theater of perfection, now felt heavy with memory. Curtains no longer hung with unquestioned precision. Carpets bore faint traces of hurried footsteps. Chandeliers collected layers of soot. The cleaning delayed for weeks. Even the most meticulous of households found cracks in their control, a forgotten smudge on the mantel, a dusted table uneven, a servant who spoke too freely. These small imperfections, once impermissible, were now accepted as the signs of life persisting beyond rigid rule. The people themselves carried the weight of centuries in their posture and manners, but many were beginning to shed it. The daughters who had once bowed at every greeting now walked unhesitatingly, their eyes meeting others without fear. Widows who had waited a year and a day to reappear in public now stepped confidently into streets and social spaces. Men who had dictated conversation with iron precision allowed laughter, debate, and even dissent to enter their drawing rooms. The old order, measured in courtesy, silence, and repression, had begun to erode from the inside. Yet the dust remained. It clung to memory, to habit, to the invisible notion of what it meant to be proper. In quiet moments at dusk, when the city's fog hung low and the gaslights cast trembling shadows, one could still feel it settling. On the gloved hands of women adjusting their gowns, on the hands of children who had been taught to sit still, on the shoulders of men who had never learned to breathe without permission. It was a residue of fear, of restraint, of a century spent bending the natural pulse of life into conformity. Even as rebellion and change swept through schools, streets, and parlors, the etiquette of dust lingered. The streets, though filled with women walking upright and speaking boldly, were still lined with invisible expectations. The home, though more relaxed, retained the ghostly precision of 1,000 forgotten commands. Victorian society had taught its citizens to endure, and the habit, once formed, was difficult to unlearn. And so, as the century drew to a close, the dust settled quietly over London. It bore witness to what had been endured, what had been controlled, and what had been broken. The women who had learned to rise without bowing, the children who had spoken when forbidden, the men who had laughed aloud, all moved forward into a new age. Yet the dust remained, a soft reminder that history never truly forgets, that manners, morality leave their trace even when the world changes. The gaslights flickered one final time for the century, illuminating curtains, carpets, and the occasional gloved hand. And in that moment, the city seemed to exhale, carrying both the weight of its past and the promise of a future unbound. Respectability had fallen, but its dust, like memory, would linger forever.